The most dangerous mistake in any room is believing the quietest person knows the least. The words would come back to Ethan Caldwell many times over the following year, but on that rainy Thursday evening, they would have sounded almost ridiculous. Manhattan shimmered beneath a curtain of steady rain as black SUVs lined the curb outside Ashford House, one of the city's most exclusive restaurants. Inside, crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across polished walnut tables, while the muted sound of piano music drifted through conversations worth millions of dollars. At the center of the private dining room, Ethan Caldwell, 39, founder of one of America's fastest-growing investment firms, glanced at his Swiss watch for the third time in less than 5 minutes. He wasn't impatient because someone was late. He was impatient because uncertainty had entered a meeting where uncertainty wasn't welcome. Across from him sat 3 distinguished guests from overseas, accompanied by attorneys, financial advisors, and 2 highly respected interpreters. A partnership valued well into 9 figures rested on tonight's discussion, yet no one seemed focused on contracts anymore. Instead, every pair of eyes had settled on something absurdly ordinary lying in the middle of the mahogany table. It was a white paper napkin, folded once, slightly stained by a ring left from a coffee cup. Across its surface, someone had written several elegant characters in dark blue ink. They flowed like tiny works of art, graceful and deliberate, nothing like the printed symbols most people recognized from textbooks or smartphone apps. Ethan had already asked both interpreters to translate them. The first quietly admitted he couldn't. The second frowned for nearly a full minute before slowly shaking his head. "I've never seen this style before," he confessed. One attorney leaned closer. Could it be decorative handwriting? Another adjusted his glasses. Perhaps an old regional dialect. The oldest guest across the table smiled politely, but said nothing. That silence carried more weight than any answer. Ethan disliked silence. Numbers produced answers. Contracts produced answers. Markets produced answers. Silence only produced risk. He leaned back, hiding his frustration behind practiced composure. There has to be someone who can read it. Nobody responded. The room felt smaller. Even the piano beyond the private doors seemed farther away. Outside, rain tapped softly against the tall windows overlooking Park Avenue. Meanwhile, just beyond those closed doors, Claire Bennett balanced a silver tray against one hand as she refilled water glasses with effortless precision. At 27, she moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned long ago that the best service was almost invisible. Most guests never remembered her face. They remembered that their coffee stayed warm, their plates arrived exactly on time, and somehow every small inconvenience disappeared before they noticed it. Tonight was no different. She offered polite smiles, thanked guests softly, and slipped between tables without interrupting conversations. She wasn't listening to anyone's business. She never did. But as she approached the private room carrying fresh, sparkling water, one unfamiliar sound reached her ears before the door fully closed behind another server. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't even a language. It was a puzzled sentence. None of us can identify these characters. Claire's footsteps slowed for barely half a second. Her eyes instinctively drifted toward the folded napkin resting in the middle of the conference table. Only a brief glance. No more than 2 heartbeats. Then she continued walking exactly as before. Yet something almost imperceptible changed in her expression. Not surprise. Recognition. She quietly placed fresh glasses beside each guest without drawing attention to herself. Ethan barely noticed she had entered. His attention remained fixed on the mysterious handwriting that threatened to derail an evening months in the making. One interpreter sighed again. "I'm sorry, Mr. Caldwell. I honestly don't know what I'm looking at." Claire looked once more at the flowing blue characters. Her fingers tightened ever so slightly around the serving tray. She hesitated. Speaking would be inappropriate. Remaining silent would be easier. She lowered her eyes and turned toward the door. Then she stopped. Without raising her voice, she spoke so gently that everyone almost missed it. "Excuse me, sir." Every conversation ended instantly. Claire met Ethan's eyes with calm respect. "Those aren't complicated characters." She glanced toward the napkin before looking back at him. Someone simply wrote them the way they were taught more than a century ago. The room fell completely silent. Claire immediately wished she had remained silent. Every face around the table had turned toward her, And for one suspended moment, the only sound in the room was the faint rhythm of rain brushing against the windows. Ethan Caldwell studied her with the same expression he reserved for numbers that refused to make sense. She was wearing the standard black uniform of Ashford House, a neatly pressed white shirt, and a silver name tag that simply read Claire. There was nothing about her appearance that suggested she belonged in the middle of a conversation involving international investors, cultural advisors, and corporate attorneys. One of the interpreters offered an apologetic smile. "Miss, these are extremely specialized characters." Claire nodded politely. "Yes, sir. That is exactly why they look unfamiliar." Nobody interrupted her. She did not sound arrogant. She sounded certain. Ethan folded his hands together. "You are saying everyone in this room is looking at them the wrong way?" Claire lowered her eyes for a brief second before answering. "I believe they are reading them as modern writing. They were written using an older educational style. The brush movements were copied with a pen, but the structure remained traditional." The elderly guest across the table slowly looked up for the first time that evening. His quiet smile widened almost imperceptibly. Ethan noticed it immediately. He had spent 2 decades negotiating with executives around the world. Tiny expressions often revealed more than entire speeches. "What makes you think that?" he asked calmly. Claire hesitated. She was not afraid of the question. She was deciding how much she should say. "The fourth character," she replied softly. "Its lower stroke curves the wrong way if someone learned modern standard form. Whoever wrote this learned from an older master." One attorney leaned closer toward the napkin. Another interpreter adjusted his glasses again, studying the tiny details Claire had noticed after only a glance. Ethan found himself looking at the handwriting differently. Until now, he had only seen symbols. Claire seemed to see decisions, habits, and history. The difference unsettled him. "Can you read it?" he finally asked. Claire remained still. "Not yet." Several people exchanged puzzled looks. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Not yet." She smiled gently. "Because one character is intentionally incomplete." The room became quiet once again. The elderly guest slowly folded his hands together and watched Claire with unmistakable curiosity. "Incomplete," Ethan repeated. Claire nodded. "Yes, sir." Someone stopped writing before finishing the final stroke. "If I guessed the missing line, I might completely change the meaning." The oldest guest spoke for the first time since dinner had begun. His English carried a gentle accent, but every word was clear. "Excellent observation." Every head turned toward him. He continued smiling as though he had been waiting all evening to hear exactly those words. Ethan leaned forward. "You already knew?" The older gentleman chuckled quietly. "Of course. I wrote it." Nobody spoke. Claire looked slightly embarrassed, almost as though she regretted drawing attention to herself. The gentleman carefully lifted the napkin and held it toward her. "Would you mind?" Claire instinctively stepped back. "Sir, I am only a server." "Tonight," he replied warmly. "I am asking for your eyes, not your job title." Ethan watched Claire more carefully than ever before. Instead of looking excited, she looked uncomfortable. She glanced briefly toward the dining room beyond the private doors where another table was waiting for fresh coffee. Her responsibilities had not disappeared simply because this room had become interested in her. That small detail surprised Ethan more than anything else. Most people rushed toward attention. Claire seemed ready to walk away from it. After a long breath, she accepted the napkin with both hands, treating the simple piece of paper with unexpected care. She did not rush. She did not perform. She simply observed. Her eyes moved slowly across each graceful line of ink, following every curve exactly as though she were listening instead of reading. Then she looked toward the center of the table. "May I please borrow a pen?" she asked quietly. For several seconds, no one moved. The request sounded almost ordinary, yet it carried an unexpected weight. Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his navy jacket and removed a polished black fountain pen that had accompanied him through countless negotiations. He hesitated for only a heartbeat before placing it gently on the table and sliding it toward Claire. She looked at the pen, then back at him. "Thank you, sir." Her voice remained calm. She did not pick it up immediately. Instead, she carefully unfolded the napkin completely, smoothing each corner with the same precision she used when arranging linen before dinner service. The elderly guest watched every movement with growing interest. Even the interpreters leaned forward without realizing they had done so. Claire finally lifted the pen. She did not begin writing. She simply held the tip above the unfinished character, studying the empty space as though listening for something no one else could hear. Ethan found the silence strangely uncomfortable. He had built his career on quick decisions. Markets rewarded speed. Investors rewarded confidence. Yet this young waitress seemed perfectly willing to spend an entire minute thinking before making a single mark. Somehow, nobody dared interrupt her. Outside the private dining room, dishes clinked softly, servers exchanged quiet greetings, and the restaurant continued its elegant rhythm, completely unaware that time inside this room seemed to have slowed. Claire exhaled almost imperceptibly. Then she lowered the pen. One graceful stroke appeared across the paper. Nothing dramatic. No flourish. Just one deliberate line. She immediately placed the pen back on the table instead of continuing to write. "That should complete it," she said softly. The elderly gentleman looked down at the napkin. His smile disappeared, replaced by something far deeper than surprise. It looked like recognition. He gently closed his eyes for a brief moment before opening them again. "Perfect," he whispered. One interpreter quickly leaned closer. "That is all." Claire nodded. The sentence was already there. It simply could not breathe until the final stroke connected the thought. The room remained silent. Ethan glanced from the napkin to Claire, searching for any sign of performance. There was none. She looked almost embarrassed by the attention. The elderly guest carefully turned the napkin toward everyone else. "Would you like to know what it says now?" Nobody answered because everyone already wanted the same thing. He read the completed sentence slowly in his native language before translating it himself into English. "Knowledge loses its value when respect arrives too late." The words settled over the room with remarkable stillness. They did not sound like a business proverb. They sounded personal. Ethan repeated them quietly under his breath. "Respect arrives too late." The sentence lingered in his mind longer than he expected. One of the attorneys cleared his throat. Was this intended as a message for tonight's negotiation? The elderly gentleman smiled warmly. Not exactly. It was intended to reveal how people respond when they encounter something unfamiliar. He turned toward Claire. Most people immediately search for authority. She searched for understanding. Ethan rested both hands on the edge of the table. "You expected someone to notice the missing stroke?" "I hoped someone would." The older man chuckled gently. "Usually people try to impress me by pretending they understand. Your waitress was the only person who admitted she could not read the sentence until it was complete." Claire lowered her eyes. "Guessing would have been disrespectful." "Exactly." The gentleman nodded with unmistakable admiration. Humility often protects wisdom better than confidence does. Ethan felt an unfamiliar sensation settling quietly inside him. It was not embarrassment. It was perspective. For the first time that evening, he realized he had never actually looked at Claire before she spoke. She had refilled his water, arranged fresh silverware, and quietly moved around the room for nearly 20 minutes. Yet she had remained almost invisible. Not because she lacked presence, but because everyone had decided in advance what they expected a waitress to know. Claire gently pushed the napkin back across the table toward its owner. "Thank you for allowing me to see it, sir." She stepped back, preparing to return to the dining room before anyone could stop her. But just as her hand reached the door handle, Ethan spoke again, this time without the authority that usually defined his voice. "Miss Bennett." She turned politely. "Yes, sir." Ethan held her gaze for a long moment before asking the one question that suddenly mattered far more than the business deal waiting on the table. "Who taught you to see writing like that?" Claire remained by the door, her hand resting lightly on the polished brass handle. She seemed almost surprised that the question had been directed to her instead of one of the scholars or attorneys seated around the table. For a brief moment, she considered offering the simplest possible answer, the kind that would allow her to leave quietly and return to the tables waiting outside. But something in Ethan Caldwell's expression had changed. The confidence that had dominated the evening was still there, yet it had been softened by genuine curiosity. "My grandfather," she answered at last. "He was not related to me by blood, but he raised me after my parents passed away." The room grew quiet again, though this silence felt different. It was no longer filled with uncertainty. It was filled with attention. Claire continued speaking carefully, never raising her voice. "He believed handwriting carried memory. He used to say that every generation leaves tiny fingerprints inside the way it writes. And if you learn to see those details, you begin to understand the people, not just the words." Ethan listened without interrupting. He realized she was not trying to impress anyone. She was simply answering a question honestly. The elderly guest folded the completed napkin with remarkable care before placing it inside the pocket of his jacket. Your grandfather was a wise man. Claire smiled gently. He would have disagreed. He always said wisdom belonged to people who never stopped learning. The older gentleman laughed quietly. Then perhaps that is why he became wise. One of the interpreters looked toward Claire with open admiration. Where did he teach? Claire shook her head. Mostly at our kitchen table. Several people smiled, assuming she was joking. She was not. Every Sunday morning, he placed blank paper beside breakfast. While other families solved crossword puzzles, we copied old characters. If I rushed, he would make fresh pancakes and tell me to start over after breakfast because beautiful writing could never grow from an impatient mind. Even Ethan smiled at the image. It was simple, ordinary, almost impossible to connect with the elegant precision she had demonstrated only minutes earlier. Did you study linguistics in college? One attorney asked. Claire hesitated before answering. No, sir. I studied history for 2 years at the local community college while working evenings. After my grandfather became ill, school had to wait. She said the words without bitterness. They sounded like facts instead of regrets. Ethan noticed that detail immediately. Throughout his career, he had met countless people eager to explain why life had treated them unfairly. Claire did not speak that way. She accepted each chapter of her life with quiet dignity, as though every experience had taught her something worth keeping. The elderly guest slowly rose from his chair. Although age had added a slight stiffness to his movements, his presence still carried effortless grace. He walked around the table until he stood directly before Claire. May I ask you one more question? She nodded respectfully. Of course, sir. When you first looked at my writing, what was the very first thing you noticed? Claire answered without hesitation. That the person who wrote it cared more about preserving tradition than showing off skill. The gentleman blinked in surprise. How could you possibly know that? She smiled softly. Because the strokes are careful instead of dramatic. They are written by someone who loves the lesson, more than the applause. The older man's eyes glistened with quiet emotion. He bowed his head slightly, a gesture so natural that no one questioned it. Your grandfather taught you well. Ethan watched the exchange with growing fascination. This evening had begun with financial projections, legal documents, and strategic partnerships. Yet somehow the conversation had drifted toward pancakes, old notebooks, and lessons shared across a kitchen table. Strangely, it felt more valuable than anything printed inside the thick presentation folders waiting unopened beside him. Claire glanced toward the hallway again. A fellow server caught her eye through the partially opened door and gave a subtle nod, silently reminding her that another section of the restaurant still needed attention. Claire nodded back almost imperceptibly. Duty was waiting. She turned toward the guests with her familiar professional smile. If there is nothing else you need, I should return to work. Ethan instinctively started to reply, then stopped himself. For the first time in years, he realized that respecting someone's time sometimes meant allowing them to leave instead of asking them to stay. Claire slipped quietly back into the dining room as though nothing unusual had happened. Within seconds, she was refilling coffee for an elderly couple celebrating their anniversary, recommending a seasonal dessert to a family visiting from Ohio, and replacing a forgotten spoon before anyone had to ask. The rhythm of the restaurant welcomed her back without ceremony. Plates arrived. Conversations continued. Soft piano melodies floated through the warm evening air. To every guest except one, Claire Bennett was simply an attentive waitress finishing another busy shift. Ethan Caldwell remained seated long after she disappeared beyond the private room doors. The contract folders still rested unopened beside him. The financial projections that had occupied his attention all week suddenly felt strangely distant. Instead, he found himself watching the dining room through the glass panels in the door. Claire never hurried, yet she was never behind. She anticipated needs before customers spoke. She noticed an empty water glass from across the room. She quietly picked up a dropped napkin before a child realized it had fallen. None of those actions seemed extraordinary on their own. Together, they revealed something Ethan had overlooked for years. Excellence rarely announced itself. It simply became impossible to ignore once someone finally paid attention. The elderly guest followed Ethan's gaze and smiled knowingly. You are no longer thinking about our partnership. Ethan gave a small laugh. Apparently not. Good. The older gentleman folded his hands comfortably. Business can wait 5 minutes. Learning should never have to. Ethan looked back toward him. You planned all of this, did you not? The gentleman tilted his head slightly. Which part? The unfinished character. Yes. And the lesson? The older man smiled. That depended on who was sitting around the table. Ethan leaned back thoughtfully. You wanted to see whether we valued knowledge. No. The answer came gently, but without hesitation. I wanted to see whether you valued people before knowing what they could offer you. The words settled quietly between them. Nobody reached for a contract. Nobody checked a phone. Even the attorneys remained unusually silent. One of them finally spoke. That is not a typical business evaluation. The gentleman chuckled softly. Neither is trust. He reached for his teacup before continuing. For decades I have watched organizations spend millions hiring brilliant people while quietly overlooking extraordinary ones standing only a few feet away. Titles become louder than character. Resumes become louder than curiosity. Eventually, everyone forgets to actually look at each other. Ethan lowered his eyes toward the polished wooden table. Memories surfaced unexpectedly. The security guard who greeted him every morning by name. The receptionist who always remembered visiting clients without checking a schedule. The maintenance supervisor who once noticed a safety issue before any executive had recognized it. How many remarkable people had he passed without ever asking about their stories? The realization was uncomfortable because it felt honest. Through the doorway, Claire laughed softly at something an elderly customer had said. It was not a loud laugh. It carried no performance. It disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. Yet Ethan noticed it immediately. The same woman who had analyzed century-old handwriting with astonishing precision now patiently explained the difference between two homemade soups to a retired schoolteacher. There was no trace of superiority in her voice. She treated every conversation with the same quiet respect. The elderly guest noticed Ethan watching again. Do you know why she impressed me? Ethan answered carefully. Because she understood the writing. The gentleman shook his head. No, because after understanding it, she never tried to prove she was smarter than anyone else. He paused before adding, knowledge becomes beautiful only after humility gives it a place to live. Ethan slowly nodded. Those words reached somewhere deeper than business strategy ever could. At that moment, Claire approached another table where a young boy struggled to fold his paper menu back together. Without interrupting the family's conversation, she gently folded it into a simple paper crane and placed it beside his glass of lemonade. The child's face lit up with quiet amazement while his parents smiled with grateful surprise. She simply wished them a pleasant evening and continued walking as though she had done nothing remarkable. Ethan watched the little paper bird resting on the table. It was made from something ordinary, just as a forgotten napkin had become something unforgettable only an hour earlier. For the first time in many years, he began to wonder whether the most valuable people in his world had never been hidden at all. Perhaps he had simply never learned where to look. The dinner resumed, but it no longer felt like an ordinary business meeting. The conversation gradually returned to investment strategies, market forecasts, and long-term partnerships, yet something subtle had shifted beneath every sentence. The elderly guest listened carefully to each proposal, occasionally asking thoughtful questions that revealed not only his experience, but also his priorities. He rarely interrupted financial discussions. Instead, he asked about leadership, about responsibility, about the culture inside Ethan Caldwell's company. Ethan answered honestly, though he found himself choosing different words than he normally would. Numbers still mattered, but they no longer seemed like the strongest evidence he could offer. Character suddenly felt just as important. Nearly an hour passed before the dessert plates were cleared away. Claire entered the private dining room, once more carrying a polished silver coffee service. She moved with the same quiet confidence as before, never assuming that the earlier conversation had changed her role. She poured fresh coffee with steady hands, thanked each guest, and prepared to leave again. The elderly gentleman looked toward her with a warm smile. Miss Bennett. She stopped politely. Yes, sir. Would you honor me by answering one final question? Claire nodded. Of course. He gently placed his empty coffee cup onto its saucer. If your grandfather were sitting here tonight, what do you think he would tell all of us? The room became still. Claire lowered her eyes for a moment, almost hearing a familiar voice from years ago. When she finally spoke, Her words arrived slowly, each one carrying quiet certainty. He would probably thank everyone for listening before answering. A few people smiled. Claire continued. Then he would remind us that every person knows something we do not. The moment we assume otherwise, we stop learning. Nobody spoke after that. The simplicity of the thought somehow made it impossible to improve upon. Ethan felt the sentence settle inside him more deeply than any leadership seminar he had ever attended. The elderly guest reached into the pocket of his jacket and carefully removed the folded napkin once again. He placed it beside his coffee cup and looked directly at Ethan. This partnership has always depended on trust more than profit. Ethan nodded. I agree. Then allow me to tell you the real reason I wrote that unfinished sentence. Everyone around the table leaned forward slightly. The older gentleman smiled with gentle honesty. 3 months ago, I visited another company that wanted the same opportunity you do tonight. I left the exact same napkin on their conference table. Ethan listened without moving. Do you know what happened? The gentleman asked. Ethan quietly shook his head. They immediately called 3 consultants, searched online databases, argued over translations for nearly 40 minutes, and finally declared the writing meaningless because nobody important could identify it. He paused before looking toward the dining room, where Claire was already serving another table. Not one person considered asking the people already working around them. Ethan followed his gaze. Claire was helping an elderly woman carefully pack half of her dessert into a small box to take home. She listened with complete attention, smiling as though that conversation mattered just as much as any billion-dollar agreement. The gentleman continued softly. That was the moment I decided not to do business with them. One attorney looked genuinely surprised. Because of a napkin? No, the gentleman answered. Because of what the napkin revealed. Ethan understood before anyone else did. The handwriting had never been the test. The missing stroke had never been the challenge. The real question had been far simpler. Who in the room believed wisdom could appear wearing an ordinary uniform? The answer had determined everything. Ethan slowly stood from his chair and walked toward the window overlooking the rain-covered streets below. Headlights reflected across the wet pavement like ribbons of light stretching through Manhattan. He thought about every interview he had conducted, every promotion he had approved, every meeting where only the loudest voices received attention. For years he had believed excellence naturally rose to the surface. Tonight had quietly proven the opposite. Sometimes excellence remained invisible simply because nobody bothered to look down from the head of the table. Behind him, the elderly guest carefully folded the napkin one last time before placing it back into his pocket. Mr. Caldwell, he said warmly, our companies can build successful businesses together. But after tonight, I believe something even more valuable has begun. Ethan turned toward him with quiet understanding. For the first time in a very long while, he realized that the greatest investment he could make might not be in another company at all. It might be in learning to truly see the people who had been standing beside him all along. The meeting concluded just before 10 o'clock. Handshakes were exchanged, signatures were postponed until the following morning, and the private dining room gradually emptied into the quiet elegance of the restaurant lobby. Outside, the rain had softened into a light mist that wrapped Manhattan in silver reflections. Ethan Caldwell remained standing beside the entrance long after his guests had departed. His driver waited patiently beneath the covered driveway, but Ethan made no move toward the waiting car. Instead, his attention drifted back through the large front windows where the evening shift continued as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Claire Bennett was wiping down a table near the corner of the dining room. She stacked clean glasses, straightened a chair that had been pushed slightly out of place, and smiled warmly as she wished the final guests a safe drive home. There was no audience now, no investors, no important observers. Yet she worked with exactly the same care she had shown throughout the evening. Ethan realized something that quietly unsettled him. Character did not appear when people were watching. It revealed itself when nobody was. Before he could reconsider, he stepped back inside. The restaurant had grown noticeably quieter. Soft jazz replaced the earlier piano performance, and only a handful of tables remained occupied. Claire looked up as he approached, offering the same professional smile she had given him hours earlier. Good evening again, Mr. Caldwell. Did you forget something? Ethan glanced around for a moment before answering. I think I may have. She waited patiently, never attempting to finish the sentence for him. I forgot to thank you. Claire blinked once, clearly surprised by the simplicity of his reply. You are very kind, sir, but there is no need. There is every need. Ethan spoke gently. You changed the direction of an important meeting. Tonight. Claire shook her head with a quiet smile. No, sir. The meeting changed because everyone was willing to listen. Ethan almost laughed. Even now she was giving credit away instead of keeping it for herself. Would you allow me to ask one favor? She nodded politely. If it is something I can help with. Ethan reached into his wallet and removed a business card embossed with only his name, direct telephone number, and company logo. He placed it on the freshly cleaned table between them. If you ever decide to return to school, or if there is anything I can do to support your education, I hope you will call me. Claire looked down at the card but made no effort to pick it up. That is generous. It is deserved. She smiled thoughtfully before meeting his eyes again. May I tell you something my grandfather used to say? Ethan nodded immediately. Please. He believed that gifts should never become debts. Ethan remained silent, allowing her to continue. If I accepted help because I solved one small puzzle tonight, I would spend the rest of my life wondering whether I earned it or simply received it. Ethan slowly nodded. He understood. She was not rejecting kindness. She was protecting her independence. After a thoughtful pause, he gently slid the card a few inches closer. Then let us think of it differently. It is not payment. It is not charity. It is simply a door. You never have to open it. But I would regret leaving tonight without making sure it existed. Claire studied him for several quiet seconds. Something in his voice had changed completely from the businessman who had entered the restaurant earlier that evening. The confidence remained, but the certainty that he understood every room had disappeared. In its place stood genuine humility. Finally, she picked up the card and slipped it carefully into the small notebook she carried in her apron pocket beside customer orders and grocery reminders. Thank you, she said softly. Not because I know I will use it, but because I believe you offered it with respect. Ethan smiled. I did. At that exact moment, the restaurant manager approached from across the dining room. His expression revealed both curiosity and confusion. He glanced at Claire, then at one of the most recognizable business leaders in the city, standing beside a recently cleaned table. Mr. Caldwell, the manager began carefully. I hope everything this evening met your expectations. Ethan looked around the restaurant one last time before answering with complete sincerity. It exceeded them in ways I never expected. And I believe your finest investment is wearing an apron instead of a suit. The following morning arrived with clear skies and crisp autumn air, but Ethan Caldwell carried the previous evening with him long before he stepped into the glass headquarters of Caldwell Capital. The familiar lobby buzzed with quiet efficiency. Employees crossed polished marble floors carrying laptops, coffee cups, and meeting folders. Security guards greeted executives by name. Receptionists welcomed visitors with practiced smiles. For years, Ethan had walked through this building focused only on the next decision waiting upstairs. Today, for the first time, he slowed down. He noticed the custodian carefully polishing fingerprints from the front doors before clients arrived. He thanked the young receptionist who had quietly reorganized a complicated meeting schedule after a delayed flight. He even stopped to ask the security officer how his daughter's first semester of college was going. The surprise smile he received in return stayed with him all morning. Inside the executive boardroom, his leadership team gathered for the weekly strategy meeting. Charts filled the large display screens. Revenue forecasts stretched across polished conference tables. Yet before anyone opened the first presentation, Ethan closed his laptop. The room fell silent. Before we discuss business, he began calmly, I would like to discuss people. Several executives exchanged curious glances. Ethan rarely started meetings this way. He looked around the room with unusual patience. Yesterday evening, I learned something that should have been obvious many years ago. We spend enormous amounts of time searching for talent outside this company while overlooking extraordinary people standing right beside us. Nobody interrupted him. He continued, starting today, I want every department to review how we identify potential inside our own organization. Not only among managers. Everyone. One executive leaned forward. Are you proposing additional leadership training? Ethan smiled faintly. No, I am proposing better listening. The room remained quiet. I want every employee to have access to educational opportunities if they choose to grow. I want mentorship programs that include administrative assistants, maintenance staff, reception teams, security personnel, and every employee whose potential may never appear on a traditional resume. Another executive carefully asked, "What prompted this change?" Ethan paused before answering. "Someone reminded me that a person's uniform tells you where they work. It tells you nothing about what they know." Those words settled across the boardroom with unexpected force. Nobody argued. Nobody dismissed the idea. Somehow, everyone understood exactly what he meant without needing further explanation. Meanwhile, across the city, Claire Bennett began another ordinary shift at Ashford House. She tied her apron, greeted her co-workers, checked reservation lists, and arranged fresh flowers on each table before the first guests arrived. The previous evening already felt distant. She had never expected it to change her life. She certainly had not told anyone about it. To her, it had simply been one meaningful conversation among thousands of ordinary workdays. Shortly before lunch, the restaurant manager approached her with an expression she had never seen before. "Claire, would you come to my office for a moment?" She quietly followed him upstairs, wondering whether she had forgotten to complete some routine task before leaving the night before. Instead, she found a small envelope resting neatly on his desk. Her name was written across the front in elegant handwriting. The manager smiled warmly. "A courier delivered this about an hour ago." Claire carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded card. No company logo covered the page. No legal language. No contract. Just one handwritten message. "Thank you for reminding me that leadership begins with attention, not authority. Yesterday, you completed more than a sentence. You completed a lesson I should have learned years ago. Because of you, hundreds of people inside my company will receive opportunities that did not exist yesterday. Respectfully, Ethan Caldwell." Claire read the note twice before quietly folding it again. There was no offer of money, no request for a meeting, no attempt to change her life overnight. Only gratitude. Somehow that made the letter feel even more valuable. The manager looked at her curiously. "Everything all right?" Claire smiled with quiet warmth. "Yes." She carefully slipped the note into the same small notebook where Ethan's business card rested beside grocery lists and customer orders. "Everything is exactly as it should be." Downstairs, the lunch crowd had already begun to arrive. The front door opened. New guests entered carrying conversations, expectations, and stories no one else could see. Claire picked up her order pad, straightened a stack of menus, and walked forward with the same calm smile she had worn every day before. The difference was invisible to everyone around her. Yet somewhere across the city, because one waitress had chosen humility over recognition and wisdom over pride, an entire company had quietly begun learning how to see people differently. 1 year later, the first cool rain of autumn returned to Manhattan almost on schedule, washing the sidewalks clean and turning the evening lights into long ribbons of gold across the pavement. Ashford House remained as elegant as ever. Crystal chandeliers still reflected warm light across polished floors. Soft piano music still floated gently through the dining room. Guests still celebrated anniversaries, closed business deals, and gathered with families over carefully prepared meals. Some things had not changed at all. Claire Bennett still wore the same black apron neatly tied at her waist. She still carried an order pad tucked into her pocket beside a small notebook that had grown slightly worn around the edges. She still greeted every guest with the same calm smile, remembered regular customers by name, and quietly noticed details that others overlooked. Many people would have expected her to accept a prestigious position somewhere else after the events of the previous year. She had received several invitations. Universities had offered continuing education guidance. Museums had reached out after hearing about her unusual knowledge of historical writing. Even a cultural foundation had invited her to volunteer during weekend exhibitions. Claire accepted some opportunities, declined others, and continued learning at her own pace. But every Thursday evening, she still chose to work at Ashford House. Not because she lacked ambition, because she believed dignity was never determined by a job title. Shortly after 7 o'clock, the front door opened and Ethan Caldwell stepped inside alone. There were no assistants behind him, no security team, and no business partners waiting at another table. He removed his coat, thanked the hostess by name, and quietly took his usual seat near the large front window. Claire approached with the same warm professionalism she offered every guest. "Good evening, Mr. Caldwell." "It is nice to see you again." Ethan smiled. "Good evening, Claire. It is nice to be back." There was no awkwardness between them anymore. Only mutual respect. As she poured fresh water into his glass, Ethan noticed a small framed sign resting on a shelf near the entrance. He had never seen it before. The words were simple. "Respect everyone. You never know whose story you are standing beside." He looked toward Claire. "Was that your idea?" She glanced at the sign and smiled gently. "No. One of our younger servers suggested it after hearing everyone talk about kindness during employee training last winter." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "It is a good reminder." "I think we all need reminders sometimes," Claire replied. During dinner, they spoke only briefly, never allowing conversation to interfere with her work. She recommended a seasonal soup, asked whether he still preferred sparkling water with lemon, and wished another family a happy birthday while carrying a dessert topped with a single candle. Ethan watched quietly as she moved through the dining room. Nothing about her sought attention, yet somehow she continued making. Ordinary moments feel meaningful. Before leaving, Ethan placed the check inside the leather folder and stood to put on his coat. Claire thanked him sincerely, exactly as she thanked every customer. As she reached for the folder, Ethan paused. "May I ask you one last question?" Claire nodded with a familiar smile. "Of course." Ethan looked around the restaurant before speaking. "Do you ever wonder what might have happened if you had stayed silent that night?" Claire thought for only a moment. "Sometimes." And she looked toward the dining room, where a new server patiently helped an elderly couple read the dessert menu. "I think someone else would eventually have finished the sentence." Ethan smiled softly. "Perhaps." Claire gently shook her head. The important part was never who held the pen. It was whether people were willing to listen when an unexpected voice spoke. Ethan felt those words settle quietly into his heart. He thanked her once more and walked toward the front door. Just before stepping outside, he turned back one final time. Claire was already helping another guest, smiling exactly as she had a year earlier, completely unaware that countless lives had changed because she chose humility over recognition. Ethan stepped into the cool evening air as rain began falling once again. This time he did not see a waitress inside an elegant restaurant. He saw a teacher whose classroom had no walls, whose lessons required no applause, and whose greatest gift was reminding people that wisdom often arrives wearing the clothes the world is least likely to notice. And perhaps that is how the quietest people change the world, not by asking to be seen, but by helping everyone else learn how to see.